Piece of paper here, and they got some questions they'd like to ask you.
Okay. And we'll see whether or not I have any answers. All right.
Okay.
Who's this?
All right. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. The subject is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and let's see. Jamie's first question was, were you affected by this confrontation? And maybe.
Just a second. You're talking about the missile crisis?
Yes.
Yeah, I was affected by it. Because when it occurred, I was on my way to do a project down in the Florida area, and I was in Atlanta at the airport when the whole thing started. And what I noticed, I didn't know what was going on, but I did know that something was on, and started to watch the television in the airport, and the president came on and talked a bit about the missiles. Now, remember, the missile crisis occurred really in two parts. There was the first part when we put missiles into Turkey directed at the Soviet Union.
You guys know where Turkey is, right? It's very close to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so since we were having lots of problems with the Soviets, we put missiles into Turkey, our ally, and the Russians got upset about it, and about a week or so later, they started to put missiles into Cuba. We knew that, and we saw on the TV every day these vessels that were coming across the Atlantic, and they were being watched by American aircraft. We had naval ships all around, and you could see the missiles sitting on the boats. And so the question was whether we would allow them to land. And my recollection is that we decided to with our Navy, prevent their landing the missiles there into Cuba.
Okay. They were exporting. They were getting the parts from the Soviet Union and bringing them over to Cuba.
Right. And they were bringing them to Cuba. Some had already arrived, apparently, and had been set up. And so the Navy decided, or the President decided, that was Kennedy at that time, decided that we would put an embargo on it, and our Navy would not allow any of the ships that had missiles aboard, which were large and where you could see them on the decks,
right?
Would not allow them to land. There was then a series of negotiations that went on for about a week, and at the end of the week, my recollection is the Russians decided to go back and take the missiles home. So the ships essentially turned around and went back. A very short time later, without any announcement, the U.S. withdrew the missiles that had been installed in Turkey. So obviously, without telling anyone, Kennedy had reached an accommodation with the president of the Soviets to remove the missiles from Turkey if they would if they would not put missiles in Cuba. And that was the end of it. The whole thing took about 2 weeks.
Okay. Jamie's got a question.
Yeah.
Did you think that President Kennedy could handle, like, this situation?
Did I what?
Think that President Kennedy could handle this situation?
Did I think he could handle it?
Yeah.
I can't say I had any real feeling about it. We depend upon our government to do that. And we would expect them to do it and to handle a situation like that. So I'm not sure that I thought that much about it.
Who was the president before Kennedy?
Pardon me?
Who was the president before Kennedy?
The immediate one before Kennedy was Eisenhower.
Who would you rather have had in the White House when the Russians were doing this? Is I guess what Jamie was asking.
Oh, okay. Would I rather have had Eisenhower or Kennedy? I think it would not have occurred if Eisenhower were the president.
That's interesting. He was pretty high up general in World War II.
Yes, he was the supreme general in World War II, with the exception of the Pacific, which was MacArthur.
Yeah.
He had two supreme commanders.
You would think that the Russians would be a little bit afraid of his capabilities.
Yeah. Well, Eisenhower was a very, very intelligent man, among other things. He was very well liked everywhere. The enemies that we had respected his capabilities. He was a great general. He was responsible, essentially, for the war, World War II, that we conducted essentially from the British Isles, like they were an aircraft carrier for us. Okay, and he conducted that whole period of time.
Okay.
So Eisenhower was very well positioned to be able to prevent things happening. I think, in all likelihood, the missiles went in undoubtedly as a response by Russia to our putting missiles in Turkey. So there's a whole question as to whether we in effect were the reason why the problem began in the first place.
Okay.
Had not put missiles in Turkey, it's very unlikely that they would even have thought in terms of putting missiles into Cuba.
How about Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian president, was he was after Stalin, and who was the other Russian president at the end of World War II?
There was Stalin was the first one. I mean, Stalin was there from 1927 until I don't know the date, but it was before the missile crisis.
Okay.
And Stalin took over. Was Generalissimo of the Russian armed forces throughout the entire war and was the chief strategist of what they did.
Okay.
Yeah. Not exactly the way our presidents work. Okay? Our presidents are not supposed to be military strategists. They're supposed to listen to what the military wants to do in a resolution of a problem that the country has, and then tell the military that they can do it or to modify what it is that they want to do. Okay? Whereas in the case of Russia, Stalin decided those things. Okay? And he was fully capable of doing so. He had been in power for a very long time. He came to power right after the end of World War I, around 1919 or 1920, and was in power from then until he died. And I don't remember when that was, but it was substantially after the missile crisis period.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't know if I answered the question or I just went on and talked.
Well, the kids are taking notes, and as you're talking.
Okay.
You got another question, James?
Okay. That's okay.
Leonard, you have a question? They're in teacher-student mode, and they're just taking notes.
Okay. Yeah.
Why don't you ask that question?
Were these questions posed by the class initially, or by the teacher, or by the students?
Hey, Grandpa? I have just a question about, were you aware of the decision to blockade Cuba instead of bombing them?
Wait a minute. I missed. It didn't come through clearly on my phone. The last half of the sentence.
Oh, wait. It was, were you aware of the decision to blockade Cuba instead of bombing them?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. We blockaded Cuba first, and as soon as we knew the missiles were coming, the Navy was sent out to intercept them and not permit them to be landed. It was clear from the beginning that our Navy was going to destroy the missiles while they were at sea.
Okay.
On the ships.
Did it feel like war was about to start?
Pardon me? Yeah, what?
Did it feel like war was about to start?
Oh, a war was about to start?
Did it feel that way?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I was when the basic problem started, I was on my way down to a project that I was working on in Florida, and I arrived in Atlanta. In those days, when you were traveling anywhere, if you were going south, you went through Atlanta. And I changed planes in Atlanta. And while I was there, the Atlanta airport, which has 4 terminals, was chock-a-block full of American soldiers, obviously on their way to someplace, and most of us assumed that that place was probably Florida, into staging locations from which they would then invade Cuba. Okay, so the airport was almost entirely soldiers, and all moving from one place to another, and they seemed to be all going to Florida. So it was pretty obvious we were going to land troops in Cuba. It was pretty obvious to anybody in Atlanta that we were going to send troops into exactly when that was relative to the start of the Cuban crisis, I don't know, but that was when I fully awakened to the fact that this was something pretty serious. Because we wouldn't have been moving armies around without having something important in mind. Remember, this is still pretty early in the development of Cuba as a problem for us. I don't remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis was in the fall of 1962. I think that was 62 or 64. I think it was 62. One of the kids will know.
Hey, Grandpa, did you already have a bomb shelter built at that point?
Yeah, I was I was one of those people who felt that I was going to survive and my family were going to survive no matter what happened. So the building of the bomb shelter was not in response to the missile crisis. It was in response to a request, in effect, put out by the federal government, actually by Kennedy, that said that Americans ought to build bomb shelters in their houses. And they designed, the government developed a design for a proper bomb shelter to be put in a cellar. And you could write to the government, to some particular address, and get the plans. And I did that, and as a result of it, I decided I would build a bomb shelter. This was a little bit in advance. It wasn't exactly in response to the missile crisis. It was in response to the fact that our government was saying, there may be a war, you know, and if there is going to be a war, planes are going to come over or missiles are going to come over, and you ought to have some kind of a shelter. And they designed the shelters and encouraged people to build them. And I was encouraged enough to decide to build one. Remember, two little kids, a lot smaller than you guys are coming over, and I was moving at the time these, they were 12 inches by 24 inches by 4 inches thick concrete. They weighed about 45 pounds each block. I had to put those in too high in the ceiling of the bomb shelter, and then line the walls also with those. Those blocks up in the ceiling were very, very heavy, so I had to put in big wood columns to hold them, and plywood, and then insert the blocks. Anyway, the kid came over and he said, "What you doing, mister?" And I said, "I'm building a swimming pool." He said, okay. He understood building a swimming pool, and he went away. So when I got finished with the bomb shelter, I took everything that was left and I built a kiddie pool in the backyard out of these concrete blocks that were left over. You have to realize the size of the project. Like a truck had to come up with a crane on it and lift pallet loads of concrete that weighed 2,000 pounds or so each pallet. And he inserted them, he put them on the front lawn. And I ended up with a truckload of these concrete blocks sitting on the front lawn. Couldn't leave them there long, so I had to somehow get them into the house. I didn't want to advertise to everybody what I was doing, even though the kids next door were getting very interested in the project. I told them it was a pool, and to satisfy them, I built a small pool with the surplus blocks out behind the kitchen. And we filled that with water for the kids, and they have their feet get wet. But my most immediate problem is I had all these concrete blocks on the front lawn, and I had to get them into the house as quickly as possible. They were very heavy. I could carry two at once, but after the second trip with two, I could only carry one. And I was afraid shortly I wouldn't be able to even carry one if I got any lower. So I shifted over to taking one block at a time. So I had to take one block from the street and walk it all the way to the back of the house, and then down the stairs, upstairs to get into the house, and then I guess I had the side door then, and then downstairs and pile them in the cellar. It was a big job.
How long did that take?
I don't have any recollection of it, but I set a time standard for myself that I remember that I could carry one at a time and bring it down to the basement, then go back up and get another one, and I could do that for something like 10 blocks, and then I had to rest a while, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to make sure the breath was okay, and then go back and do another 10. Then I did that until I had the bulk of them in there. How many it was, I don't know, but it was 2 or 3 pallet loads. Each pallet was probably at least 2,000 pounds. So I probably had 10,000 to 15,000 pounds of concrete.
I suppose you didn't need to keep going to the gym to stay in shape.
No. Yeah, I also had to work every day too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I did finally get it done. And by the time I got it done, we no longer really needed it. Because whatever it was, the problem had gone away. But I left it there, and ultimately we sold the house. We didn't have the house all that long. We owned it for about 2 years or 2.5 years. And then we moved to Melville.
About what year was that?
Yeah, I left the bomb shelter there, and I'm sure the people that bought the house didn't have any idea what to do with it, but I left a lot of miscellaneous things. I left the propeller by mistake. I left the propeller from my airplane there, which was a big aluminum propeller. Didn't have anything to do with your project, but I lost my propeller there. It was underneath the oil tank. Anyway, that was the bomb shelter, and essentially I built it in response to what Kennedy and his government were saying, that you ought to be preparing for the future.
What year was that?
What year?
Yeah.
It was right at the Missile 62. Now, he'd been talking about bomb shelters a little earlier than that.
Was it wintertime or summertime? Do you remember it being hot when you?
Summertime.
Okay, so it was before the missile crisis. The missile crisis was.
Oh yeah, I did not build it in response to the missile crisis.
Okay.
The whole thing was in response to the fact that the government said we may have a war, and if we have a war, we're likely to have air raids. And if we have air raids, it would be very a good idea for you to have a bomb shelter. And they drew up a book that told how to build a bomb shelter.
And this was not necessarily for actual bombs, but the concrete was needed for radiation.
It was needed for radiation, but whatever bomb came down was going to have nuclear component.
Yeah. So
in all likelihood, that's
in order to stop
thinking in nuclear terms in that time.
So was that 2 years before the crisis?
just a few months.
It was just an interesting thing, but I was one of these people. I'm convinced that I'm going to be a survivor, and my family are going to be survivors, and I'm going to see to it that we do everything we can to survive.
Yeah.
And there were, of course, at that time, all kinds of doomsday movies on in the movie theaters too.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk and everything. They were bad days. I don't remember even the exact dates, but it was the missile crisis was about 1962. But the bomb shelter, I must have finished it by 1960 at the latest. I had it in. Now remember, I went into Europe at the end of World War II, and people in Europe had been doing all this all the time. And people in the big cities went down into the subways. But if there wasn't enough room in the subways, people built their own shelters. Adolf Hitler built his shelter under the Reichstag. Okay, and he had one that's where he finally committed suicide.
Wow.
Okay, so everybody had bomb shelters in Europe. So I was used to seeing you didn't go down and look at people's bomb shelters, but they all had to have some place to be able to go when the airplanes came over, because they were being bombed every day.
So do you think your reasoning to build the bomb shelter was based on your experiences and how people reacted to these sort of things in Europe?
Yeah, pretty much.
Whereas Americans that had not been in Europe during the World War II may not have really feared this situation at all.
It's quite probable. Yeah, we've never been attacked here. In isolated terrorists kind of things, but we have never really been attacked by anybody from outside, not in modern times.
Okay.
I was just looking at the numbers on the size of our army, and if anybody decided to attack us, would have to be out of his mind. Our armies are very big.
Yeah.
Even today, when we don't have any problems other than a few things like Afghanistan. But we, somehow or other, we made a change in a philosophy or in ideas of around that time, like 1960, give or take a few years, that you should be prepared for these things. But anyway, that's about the way it was. And I had seen a lot in Europe. Well, I was one of my duty cities. When I was stationed in Bamberg, Germany, which you can look it up on a map. It's about 200 miles south and a little west of Berlin. It's actually 20 miles north of Nuremberg, which is an easy city to locate. Should have thought of that. was there, usually soldiers wanted to get away from other soldiers and just relax a little regularly. And so when I got to Bamberg, I relieved someone and I took his job, and he was going home to the U.S. And he brought me down to introduce me to a family. I do not remember their name, but they lived in a house. They owned a butcher store, and it sold some groceries, but primarily meat and fish. And it was built in a building that was the eastern bridge tower for a major highway that went across the Main River, M-A-I-N River. Naturally, our army decided, or the German army decided to blow it up, or we decided to blow it up. It was dependent on who wanted to get to the other side better. But in any event, they blew up. I think it was the German army that probably did it. They blew up the building. They didn't do a very good job on it. They just blew all of the rooms that faced the street out. And so when you were standing in the street, you could see the doors to the bedrooms and to the kitchen from the street. And it was a middle-class home. They had their own business, a butchery, but they didn't butcher. They were a butcher. They were a butcher. Okay, the family. My point was, I used to visit them twice a week, just to get away from the military base where I was. We had 20,000 men stationed in 4 very large buildings that looked kind of like apartment buildings. They had windows in each room, but each room held about 20 soldiers. It had been a German army caserne, or like fortification, fortified location. They had 4 of these buildings, and in the buildings were about 20,000 men who represented an armored division, a panzer division. And the area was surrounded by woods, and the Panzer Kaserne, the 4 buildings, housed all of the soldiers of the division. We put all the soldiers in behind barbed wire, and we took over the buildings and moved in. And so you were always surrounded by large numbers of other soldiers. And to get away from it, I got away a couple of days a week, or evenings really, and I went down to visit my friends, the butchers, and I would take a bath. I would bring soap with me, which was very valuable for a German. They couldn't get soap. And you just had to very carefully make sure you left the soap in the bathtub, or in the holder. And I was always welcome to come down and take a bath, and I did about twice a week. Visited them.
Wow. So these were German citizens, and they were friendly to American soldiers after the war.
Oh yes, I went back to visit them. Yes. When I transferred down to the European Theater Intelligence School in Oberammergau, I used to do some traveling because I had to go around intelligence units various reports and materials that I needed. So I would take a truck and a driver and go out and go visiting towns that had information that I needed.
Now you were you were working a bit on Soviet intelligence. The Soviets were probably the biggest concern after the war.
Yes.
And this at this point was the very beginning of the Cold War, which the missile crisis became a part of.
Yes, absolutely. To go back a little bit in history, the Germans made a proposal at the end of the war when they saw they were going to lose. The German government made a proposal to the Allies to join Allies and attack Russia. Their concept was that when we came in there to Germany, that they would link their armies up with ours, and together we would go into Russia and get rid of this Russian menace. The Germans all thought that that was going to work, that we would do it. And we never had any intention of doing so. And I told people that I knew they're Germans, no, we're not going to do anything like that. We have no quarrel with the Russians. We're allied with them. We did have some trouble with the Russians. Fact is, what I was doing was training Americans who spoke German or who were like Kittinger. Okay, I'll use him as an example because he was in the next office to mine.
Henry Kissinger, the future Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, yeah. Kittinger was a German who left, as did Einstein, left Germany and came to the U.S. He was probably Jewish. He probably really had to leave. But in any event, he did escape. And he was in the U.S. Army in the same unit that I was in Germany. So anyway, Kissinger was training. We had a group of classrooms, and we brought people who we were proposing to make into intelligence agents. We brought them in and lectured them on a whole variety of activities that an intelligence agent ought to know. I taught them how to blow up cars and buildings and bridges and things like that, and told them how you go about getting the munitions to do it. Kissinger taught them how to recognize a German who was not in favor of the regime or who was in favor of the regime. And we lectured these people and taught them things that they needed to know in order to go out into the population. Remember, we have lots and lots and lots of German Americans. And so we were essentially training German Americans like Kittinger on how to infiltrate into the population. The function of that was to watch for any signs of, we'd call it terrorism today, anything. But in those days, we did not want to see small groups of Germans get together and plot this evening on how to blow up the military police station down the street, okay? So we were training people to search out that kind of activity and to head it off at the pass so it didn't happen. And I was teaching those same people how to blow up the building if that was the way they needed to get in.
Okay.
Anyway, it was an interesting job that I had. Okay?
So
I was training new groups of people about every 4 weeks or 5 weeks.
okay.
I forget the exact timing. And it was very interesting work. Okay, next question, if any.
Yeah, they have a bunch of questions that they wrote themselves. These are not questions from school.
Two more.
Yeah.
Why don't you ask the next one, James?
How did you feel about Rudolf Anderson discovering the missiles in San Cristobal?
I don't know the incident.
Okay. And how did you feel about Fidel Castro?
Well, I thought Fidel Castro was a serious problem for us. It turned out that we never did anything about it, but it looked for a long time as though we would. And that could easily have been the next war I got involved with. But it never happened.
What was the worst part of the crisis?
Essentially, all we did was isolate Cuba and try to keep them poor and not able to do us any harm. Obviously, initially there was this business of the cruise missiles and bringing them in, and we were very alarmed about that. And obviously, our government decided that was certainly never going to happen again. And so they put their embargo on and effectively prevented it. And we're almost getting to be friendly with Fidel now.
I've got another question. It's when you were an engineer, did you have any problems with workers not following directions when it came to protecting themselves during the air raid drills?
Whose air raid drills?
Anyway, in schools there were air raid drills.
Yeah, there were air raid drills. I hadn't thought about it in 50 years, but yes, we did have them. They were done the same way as a fire drill. They blew the horns, and everybody lined up and went out and marched down to the basement. And you stayed there until the all clear, and then the all clear came. We've done things like that for a long time. I'm used to working in the Midwest, where they have tornadoes that come around all the time. And if you're in an area where the tornadoes come around, you're used to listening, always having a radio on that will give you a warning in case a tornado is coming. And if a tornado is in the area, the radio will signal it. Everybody, I don't know if they still have them. They probably have some better device, but normally you just used a radio and you had it on your desk and it was turned on to the right channel. And you listened, and if the beep came on, you had to go to a safe area. So the school children did exactly the same thing, and we had those drills, but they were the same as the fire drills, which you probably always do now also. Except, you went down, whether you went outside or whether you went into the basement had to do with whether you were expecting a bomb, I guess, or a fire. But
was there a different alarm sound? How did you know what kind of an alarm it was? What did the alarms sound like for a fire versus a bomb?
Well, we didn't have any. We didn't have any bombs, so we didn't have an alarm for it. We had always there was always a loudspeaker system.
Okay.
Where the principal could say something. I don't know whether you have them now or not. Do you have such a system?
Yeah.
Just fire.
No.
Yeah, we only have one for the fire.
You have one for the fire. Okay. No, we wouldn't have made a distinction between a fire and a bomb. We were not expecting bombs. That was not in our lexicon. We were not expecting bombs. We did not expect airplanes to come over us and bomb us because they couldn't get across the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans to get to us. And we figured the Canadians were safe.
the Mexicans weren't really a trouble either.
No. So we weren't really worried about bombing.
So what was the scariest part of the whole time period?
I guess we need to define the time period.
The Cold War, anywhere from the 1955. I guess the Cold War was really, maybe it started in 1945, but in the 1960s Cold War era.
Yeah, 60s is probably a reasonable time to think. That's when you were growing up, Greg.
Yeah.
I've lost my train of thought. What are we talking? What's the
about?
question?
What was the scariest part? Was there I think there was a missile threat, but after the missile threat was diffused, there was still a lot of tension. I remember in the news later on in the 1970s, they're always talking about the time. They had a clock which listed the time, the countdown till World War III, and it was always, we were at 11:55 p.m. and midnight would be considered war.
Yeah, but we didn't have that clock in the school, and we didn't have that clock at home.
Right.
That was just somebody trying to scare us that the direction that we were going was towards a war. That period pretty well expired. I think it expired in the 60s. I don't remember being worried at all about being attacked. I don't even remember it in the 60s.
Yeah.
We felt pretty confident of ourselves.
I don't remember it.
Yeah. Peg doesn't either.
Were you ever really afraid of anything that was about to happen?
No,
You
I
just
wasn't.
you kept going along with life as it went along.
Yeah, I didn't worry about it.
Other than disliking the Russians in the Olympic Games.
I thought about things like a bomb shelter primarily because I got a letter from the federal government that says President Kennedy, signed by President Kennedy, that says, I think you ought to be building a bomb shelter.
Ah.
And I said, I was in Europe and I saw what you can do with an airplane to a city, and I thought it would be a good idea to have a bomb shelter.
Okay.
And I could do it for a reasonable cost. And I got the plans and I went ahead and did it. That was just, I think, a normal reaction to the times. I don't want to, you don't want to sit there and say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. If a bomb comes, it comes. Well, there is something you can do about it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, some people will say what we will do is we'll march on Washington and make sure that they take care of this problem. Or
No.
I was more inclined to put in a bomb shelter and then say I've done the best I can.
Now, you were living in Freeport, New York, which was pretty close to New York City, and New York City was likely a target.
Oh, yes. We expected it to be a target. Yeah. Although a bomb hitting New York City wouldn't have done much to Freeport.
Okay. Unless it was radiation.
Yeah. But the idea is there, yes. If something happened to New York, that would be a very important factor in our lives anyway. I wouldn't have had a job anymore because it was in a high tower in New York.
Yeah. Well, I think you've answered the kids' questions, and they've got a bunch of notes they're gonna pour through and make a report, and I think I'll show it to you when they're done.
Okay. Yeah, and if they have further questions, just have them call and ask the question, and I'll see what I can do with it.
Okay.
I hope that's what I've done is about right.
I think it's exactly right.
I think that we're all kind of away from the point, but my perspective on all these things was significantly affected by my experience in Europe when I got over there and saw what the bombings had done to the cities. You can see them now in movies and things, but to discover that you can't walk down a street because the buildings on both sides of it have fallen down and you now have to climb up over this pile of rubble, and that this goes on and on for the whole city is hard to comprehend unless you have really seen it. And I've seen that. And the other thing that I find most impressive is that if you go to those same cities now, they are completely redone, and most times to look exactly the way they looked before. It's amazing how people can recover. I can give you an example. I know I'm wandering on your subject, but it might be interesting. My point is, how did the Germans put Germany back together again after the bombing was over? They put it together in about 5 years. It was called the 5-year miracle. It was started by a man named, I'll think of the name, Eric something. It'll come to me. He was the vice prime minister. In any event, he said, what we will do is we will go out and look at every building in Germany and determine what condition it is in and how much it is going to cost to fix it. Many buildings will not need fixing because they were not bombed. But of the buildings that were bombed, we need to know how many there were and how much it's going to cost to fix them. And when we get finished, we'll set up a fund. And let's say a bomb landed on Greg's house, your house, and blew it up. But the two houses next door, one on each side, were not bombed and were not blown up. Okay? The two houses, the house that was not bombed would put the equivalent value that was needed to rebuild Greg's house into a fund. Actually, this was done on a citywide basis. And so every house every house had been evaluated before the war, the same way as your house today has been evaluated. They know what it's worth, okay, down in town hall. So if yours was destroyed, you were entitled to get back the money necessary to rebuild it. And that had to come from your neighbors whose houses were not destroyed. And in that way, they leveled the playing field for everyone in Germany. Everyone had to put money in. Everybody whose house was undamaged had to put money into this rebuilding fund so that the people's houses that had been destroyed, even if they were 200 miles away or 1,000 miles away, if somebody else's house was destroyed, he had to have the money to put back together again. And the Germans in 1950 established a huge fund in which every house in the country was evaluated of its condition at the end of the war. And they knew its condition at the beginning of the war because they were on the tax records.
Right.
And the people whose houses survived had to put in enough money to rebuild the houses that were bombed.